September 2nd, 1651. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, the heart of the Ottoman Empire. A violent coup is underway. But the attackers are not a foreign army. They are not the elite Janissary soldiers. They are the imperial eunuchs, the internal security of the harem. And they are hunting a single 60-year-old woman. Their target is the most powerful woman in Ottoman history, the Valide Sultan, the mother of the empire, the Grand Regent, Kösem Sultan. She is found not on a throne, but hiding in a small closet. She is dragged out, her jewels stuffed into her pockets, her regal robes torn. She fights like a lioness, but she is outnumbered. The eunuchs, acting on a new order, throw a rope, some say a curtain cord, around her neck. She is strangled to death on the spot. Her naked, bleeding body is dragged out of the harem and thrown into the palace courtyard, a message to all who would defy the new power. The person who gave the order? The new Valide Sultan, her own 24-year-old daughter-in-law, Turhan. This was not just a murder. It was the climax of a 130-year civil war. A war fought not by men with armies, but by women with secrets. How did the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful state in the world, a hyper-patriarchal system ruled by a godlike sultan, fall under the complete control of its female slaves? How did the Topkapi Harem, dismissed by the world as a gilded cage of beautiful concubines, become the real center of government, a place where slaves became queens, and queens became king-killers? This is the story of the Sultanate of Women, the brutal, untold truth of the secret rulers of the Ottoman Empire. To understand how these women seized power, you must first understand the brutal system they were trapped in. The imperial harem was not a brothel as Western fantasy imagined. It was a machine, a dynastic, political, and familial institution ruled by ironclad laws. Its purpose was singular: to produce a male heir for the sultan. The women of the harem were almost all slaves, captured in wars or bought at markets. Circassians, Georgians, Ukrainians, Venetians. They were brought to the palace, converted to Islam, educated in music, poetry, and politics. They were chattel, but they were also the potential mothers of a future god. The harem was a pyramid of power. At the top was the sultan. Beneath him, his mother, the Valide Sultan, who ruled the harem itself. Then came the kadimlar, his favored concubines, and at the bottom, the hundreds of kariyeler, common concubines. But this pyramid was built on a foundation of blood, a horrifying tradition known as the Law of Fratricide. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who took Constantinople, codified this law. To prevent the civil wars that had nearly destroyed his ancestors, he decreed, "For the welfare of the state, whichever of my sons accedes to the throne, it is acceptable for him to kill his brothers." It was not just acceptable, it was expected. When a new sultan came to power, his first act was to send the palace executioners, the death mutes, to find all of his brothers, including infants, and strangle them with a silk cord. This law turned the harem into a death match.
a beautiful, silk-draped Hunger Games. When a concubine gave birth to a son, she did not just have a prince, she had a potential sultan, or a potential corpse. Her entire life's work became a desperate political struggle to ensure her son would be the one to survive, to gain the throne, and to murder all the others. The mothers were the first and most desperate political players. They forged alliances with eunuchs, with janissaries, with viziers, all to protect their child. This was the system, and it worked for a time, until one woman, a slave from Ukraine, arrived and decided to break every single rule.
The system was stable only as long as the Sultan remained separate from it. He was not meant to love these women. He was meant to use them. The rule was one concubine, one son. After she gave birth to a male heir, her duty was over. She was retired, her relationship with the Sultan severed, to go raise her son. Then, in the 1520s, Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest of all sultans, came to the throne. And into his harem came a slave girl known as Alexandra Lizovska. Captured by Tartars in what is now Ukraine, she was presented to the Sultan. She was not famously beautiful, but she was intelligent, joyous, and had a laugh that earned her the name HAREM'S Sultan, the cheerful one. The West would come to know her as Roxelana. Roxelana was an anomaly. She was not content to be one of many. She did what no concubine had ever dared to do. She made the Sultan fall in love with her. She was so brilliant, so captivating, that Suleiman broke every tradition. First, he broke the one concubine, one son rule. He had 6 children with her. Second, he made her his primary and eventually his only companion, ignoring the rest of the harem. Third, in 1533, in an act that shattered centuries of protocol, Suleiman the Magnificent, the shadow of God on earth, freed Roxelana from slavery and then legally married her. A slave had become the queen. The harem was stunned. The empire was scandalized. But Roxelana was just getting started. She argued that as his legal wife, she could not be separated from him by palace protocol. She convinced Suleiman to abandon the old palace where the harem was kept and move the entire harem into the Topkapi Palace, the main seat of government. This was her masterstroke. The gilded cage was no longer a separate building. It was now physically connected to the imperial council chambers, the divan. The women of the harem were now quite literally next door to the levers of power. Roxelana had brought the political deathmatch of the harem into the very heart of the government, and she was now playing to win.
Roxelana had a problem. She had many sons, but she was not the mother of the first son. That honor belonged to a concubine named Mahidevran. Her son, Shehzade Mustafa, was the heir, and he was everything a sultan should be: brilliant, charismatic, a beloved poet, and a janissary's janissary, the most popular soldier in the army. By all accounts, he was a finer man than Suleiman himself. Roxelana knew that if Suleiman died, the law of fratricide meant Mustafa would take the throne, and to secure it, he would be forced to strangle all her sons. Her survival depended on his destruction. So, Roxelana, now the most powerful woman in the empire, began a cold, patient, and systematic campaign to destroy the heir. She became her husband's chief advisor. She intercepted his mail. She controlled access to him. And she began to plant the seeds of poison. She allied herself with the Grand Vizier, Rostem Pasha, who was married to her daughter. Together, they began to feed Suleiman a steady diet of whispers. The Janissaries love Mustafa too much, they said. The soldiers whisper, he would make a better sultan than you. He is negotiating with the Persians, perhaps a coup? Suleiman, now old and paranoid, began to believe it. In 1553, during a campaign against Persia, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent. Mustafa was warned by his advisors that it was a trap. He refused to believe his father would harm him. He rode into the camp, was disarmed as protocol required, and entered the Sultan's tent. Inside, the death-mute executioners were waiting. Mustafa, a giant of a man, fought for his life. It is said it took 7 men to subdue him. As he struggled, Suleiman himself peeked out from behind a curtain to watch his own executioners strangle his firstborn, most beloved son with a silk cord. Mustafa was dead. The path was clear. Roxelana had won. Her own son, Selim, known to history as Selim the Sot or the Drunkard, would now be the heir. Roxelana, the slave from Ukraine, had changed the empire forever. She had murdered the true heir, installed a weak one, and proved that a woman's influence from within the harem was now more powerful than a prince's army in the field. The Sultanate of Women had officially begun.
The system was now broken. Roxelana's son, Selim the Drunkard, was the first in a long line of weak, incompetent, or debauched sultans. They had no interest in ruling. They were content to remain in the harem, lost in wine and pleasure. So, who ruled? The women who had put them there. The power Roxelana had created now fell to the mothers of these new weak sultans. The Valide Sultan, or Queen Mother, became the most powerful office in the empire. Nurbanu Sultan, a Venetian noble, ruled in place of her son, Murad III. Safiye Sultan, another Venetian, ruled in place of her son, Mehmed III. These women, sitting in the harem, received ambassadors, corresponded with foreign queens, like Elizabeth I of England, and dictated state policy. The harem was now the true center of government. The Grand Vizier, the head of the government, could do nothing without the approval of the Valide Sultan. And these women, just like Roxelana, were ruthless. Safiye Sultan, fearing a rival, convinced her son to murder his 19 brothers, all of them strangled in one night. The law of fratricide had reached its horrifying peak. The empire was disgusted. The public execution of 19 princes, many of them infants, was too much. The system had to change.
The law of fratricide was deemed too barbaric. So the harem invented something worse, something psychologically far more brutal. They invented the kafes. The kafes, or the cage, was the harem's solution to the problem of succession. It was a new institution created in 1617. The law of fratricide was abolished. No longer would a sultan murder his brothers. Instead, he would imprison them for life. When a new sultan took the throne, all his brothers, princes, potential heirs, were taken to a small, opulent, but windowless set of apartments deep within the harem. This was the kafes. They were locked away under constant guard by the eunuchs. They lived in lavish comfort with concubines who were often sterilized, fine food, and every luxury except freedom. They were forbidden from having children. They were forbidden from seeing the outside world. They were prisoners, living in constant daily terror that the Sultan would change his mind and send the executioners. This was the harem's monster-making machine. It solved the problem of civil war, but it created a new, far more devastating one. It ensured that any man who left the kafes to become sultan would be utterly, hopelessly insane. Imagine spending 20, 30, or 40 years in a gilded box, never seeing the sun, never having a real conversation, just waiting for the silk cord. This is what the harem now did to its future rulers. The first graduate of the kafes was Mustafa I. He had been imprisoned for 14 years. When his brother died and he was brought out, he was so traumatized he was seen throwing gold coins to the fishes and pulling the beards of his viziers. He was a gibbering lunatic. The harem had successfully, permanently, and systemically broken the mind of the sultan. The office of the Valide Sultan was now truly supreme. The harem was in total control, and the stage was set for the arrival of the greatest, most powerful, and most tragic of them all.
Her name was Kösem. A Greek slave, she entered the harem around 1604 as a favorite of Sultan Ahmed I. She was intelligent, cunning, and ruthless. She was the spiritual successor to Roxelana. Kösem was not a rule-breaker like Roxelana. She was a system master. She understood the new, broken system of the harem, and she played it perfectly. She spent her life at the center of the storm. Her husband, Ahmed I, died. His brother, the insane Mustafa I, from the kafes, was put on the throne, then deposed. Her stepson, Osman II, took the throne, and he was then murdered by his own janissaries. In the chaos, Kösem made her move. She bribed the janissaries, manipulated the viziers, and in 1623 she put her own son, Murad IV, on the throne. Murad was only 11 years old. Kösem Sultan became his official regent. For the first time in history, a woman was the official, undisputed ruler of the Ottoman Empire. This was stage one of her power. Murad IV grew up to be a monster, a hulking giant of a man, a brutal tyrant who allegedly stalked the streets of Istanbul at night, strangling any citizen he found. He was a product of the harem's violent world. But even Murad, the tyrant, could not rule without his mother. Kösem was his co-ruler.
She would sit, hidden behind a curtain, while her son held his imperial council, whispering her advice and commands to him. She was the true brain of the empire. She was the Valide Sultan. She was supreme.
In 1640, Murad IV died of cirrhosis at age 27. The throne was now supposed to pass to his last surviving brother, Ibrahim. But Ibrahim was still in the cafes. He had been locked away for 22 years, living in pure terror. When the palace officials came to his door to tell him he was the new sultan, Ibrahim was convinced they were the executioners. He barricaded himself inside. It took Kösem Sultan herself, his own mother, to come to the cafes and, holding up the dead body of his brother Murad, prove to him that he was safe. Ibrahim was brought out, and he was completely, hopelessly mad. He was psychologically broken. He had no interest in the state. He was obsessed pathologically with sex and luxury. He was known as Ibrahim the Mad. He spent his days covering his beard in diamonds and demanding his harem find him the largest woman in the empire. And for Kösem, this was perfect. This was stage 2 of her power. Her son, the Sultan, was an incompetent lunatic. She, the Valide Sultan, was the only one who could rule. She governed the entire empire openly in his name. But the monster-making machine had done its job too well. Ibrahim became too mad. His excesses bankrupted the treasury. In a fit of paranoia, he ordered his entire harem of 280 women to be tied in sacks and drowned in the Bosporus. The state was in chaos. The janissaries, the viziers, everyone knew the Sultan was a danger. They turned to the only person who could fix it, the person who had created him, his mother Kösem. And Kösem Sultan, in 1648, made the most ruthless decision of her life. To save the empire, she agreed to sacrifice her son. She gave her official, written consent to the janissary leaders. They stormed the palace, seized Ibrahim the Mad, and threw him in a dungeon. 10 days later, on her order, the executioners entered his cell and strangled her son. Kösem had murdered her own child to maintain her power. This was stage 3, the peak. She immediately put her grandson, Ibrahim's 6-year-old child, Mehmed IV, on the throne. Since the new sultan's mother, Turhan, was too young and inexperienced, Kösem declared herself Grand Valide Sultan and Regent. She had ruled through her husband. She had ruled through her son. She had murdered that son, and now she ruled officially in the name of her grandson. She was, without question, the most powerful woman in the history of Islam. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She had underestimated the new mother.
The system of the harem could only have one valid sultan, one queen mother. But now there were 2. There was Kösem, the all-powerful Grand Valid, the grandmother, and there was Turhan Sultan, the 24-year-old mother of the new sultan. For 3 years, a cold war raged within the walls of the harem. It was a war of spies, whispers, alliances, and poison. The palace was split in 2. Kösem, the old guard, was supported by the powerful, corrupt janissary corps. Turhan, the new guard, was supported by the chief black eunuch and the palace bureaucracy. It was a battle between two slave women for control of the world's most powerful empire. Kösem, realizing her power was slipping, that the young Turhan was learning the game too quickly, decided on one final, ultimate act of brutality. She would end the civil war. She plotted to have her 9-year-old grandson, the Sultan Mehmed IV, poisoned. She would then blame Turhan. After the boy was dead, she planned to put another, younger grandson, whose mother was more compliant, on the throne. She would rule undisputed until her death. It was a perfect plan, but she had forgotten who she was dealing with. Turhan was a product of the same brutal system. A harem slave loyal to Turhan overheard the plot. She ran to the young queen mother and told her everything. Kösem's assassins would strike that very night. Turhan Sultan knew that if she hesitated, she and her son would be dead by morning. She had to strike first.
This brings us back to our cold open. September 2nd, 1651. Turhan Sultan, the 24-year-old mother, gave the order. She unleashed her own agents, the head eunuch and his men, to kill the most powerful woman in the world. We now understand the scene, the coup, the hunt, the discovery of Kösem hiding in the closet, the brutal, desperate fight, the strangulation with the curtain cord. This was not a murder, it was an execution. It was the final move in a 130-year-old chess game that Roxelana had started. The Sultanate of Women had, quite literally, eaten itself. When Kösem's bloody body was thrown into the courtyard, it marked the end of an era. Turhan Sultan, the victor, ruled as regent for her son. She was powerful, but she was the last. The 130 years of chaos, of mothers murdering sons, of brothers murdering brothers, of queens murdering queens, had fatally weakened the empire. The janissaries were out of control. The government was bankrupt. The sultans were insane. The male establishment, the viziers and pashas, finally saw their chance. They seized power back from the harem, ushering in a new age. The Sultanate of Women was over. This is the brutal truth of the harem. It was not a fantasy. It was a political arena, more ruthless than any battlefield. The women who ruled it, Roxelana, Kösem, Turhan, were not simple concubines. They were political geniuses. They were slaves who became masters. They proved that even in the most oppressive patriarchal system imaginable, power will find a way. But they also proved that power, when it is absolute and unaccountable, rots. They created a system that devoured its own, that murdered its heirs, and that, ultimately, helped cripple the very empire they had fought so desperately to control. They were the secret. They were the power. And in the end, they were the poison.